Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this hardy group that did not listen to these absurd weather forecasts. I mean, I haven't been out since 8 o'clock. It's not that bad, though, is it? Good. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the privilege of serving as director of Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Hunter President Jennifer Rabb, I want to welcome you to another of our New Deal 90 events. That's how we've branded them, all of them marking 9 decades since the start of the Roosevelt presidency in 1933. So it's 90 years this month since Franklin and Eleanor left this house to go to Washington. 90 years and 2 weeks. So that's pretty extraordinary to be marking that period. And I want to, before I introduce our panel, introduce a very special guest who is not only working on an Eleanor Roosevelt miniseries, but shares a distinction with Eleanor Roosevelt, a very important one because she was the First Lady of New York State. So welcome, Silda Wald-Spitzer. So 90 years ago today, FDR had been president for 10 whole days, right? And he was focusing on what? The bank crisis. Plus ça change, right? And while he was doing that, just to make us all feel old, Quincy Jones and Michael Caine were being born. They're both 90 years old today, so I thought I would throw that in. And we always like to remind our audiences, and the regulars can practically recite this along with me, that the building blocks of the New Deal were metaphorically forged in this building, just a few flights up in the modest library that served as FDR's transition headquarters from November 8th, 1932 until March 2nd, 2023. Arguably one of the most fraught presidential transitions in American history. I think we can count Lincoln's as one. You knew I'd say that, right? And Roosevelt's the second, and the third, we don't have to go there. We all know what it was. So I wonder if you, like me, can conjure up images of FDR working in that library upstairs, meeting with the Brain Trust, welcoming Frances Perkins 90 years ago on February 5th, offering her the honor of being the first woman in the cabinet, and being told by Frances Perkins, only if you agree to do old age pensions, which became Social Security. I like to think of FDR quitting at 5 o'clock and mixing drinks, which he loved to do even in the White House at a certain hour. So we'll hear about his social hour, I'm sure, today. So we're going to take a deep dive, or a deep taste, maybe a better description, and explore the issue of prohibition and repeal with some wonderful experts and descendants of that period, and I think we're going to have some fun with it as well. So here is who you will be hearing from tonight. Robert Billingsley, not only a widely respected real estate executive here in the city, but for purposes of this evening, the son and biographer of Logan Billingsley, who was a developer in his own right, but maybe of more relevance to tonight. He was the leader of one of America's largest clans of bootleggers. This is from Bob's own bio, so I'm not being insulting, I hope, to a guest. He is also the nephew of the legendary Sherman Billingsley, the face of the legendary Stork Club, and he's working a book about his father, and we will want to have him back when that occurs. But Sherman Billingsley was not only the entrepreneur of the Stork Club, but I guess he had a bit of a bootlegger record himself earlier. You have to have bootlegger creds or you can't be on this panel. I'm delighted to welcome back our dear friend and frequent star attraction, Professor Blanche Wiesen-Cook of John Jay College and the CUNY Graduate Center, Hunter class of, wait for it now, 1962. The year of Eleanor's death, by the way. And in her years at Hunter, Blanche actually met and interacted with Eleanor Roosevelt. which is why she can channel her so convincingly, and no doubt what inspired her to be the author of the definitive multi-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. Monumental, best-selling, highly praised, our reference book whenever we have an Eleanor question. She's made many appearances here at Roosevelt House, and we're always thrilled to welcome her back. Dan Okrent is back too. We last welcomed him to celebrate his revelatory book, The Guarded Gate, Bigotry, Eugenics, and the Law That Kept 2 Generations of European Immigrants Out of America, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History and the winner of the National Jewish Book Award that year. He was a former editorial executive for Time Inc., and I'm sure some of you will remember that he was the first public editor of the New York Times. He's also the author of Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition. So again, he's got the Prohibition creds to be on our panel for tonight, and it's good, Dan, to have you back. Finally, I'm also welcoming back my friend Ralph Blumenthal, our moderator, inspiration, producer for this event. We are really grateful that he came to us with this idea. He's written widely on tonight's topic, including the books Stork Club, America's Most Famous Night Spot, and The Lost World of Cafe Society, a biography of the aforementioned Sherman Billingsley, Bob's uncle. Ralph was a reporter for the New York Times for, I think he can explain this at the reception, 45 years, from 1964 until 2009. And although he insists he left the paper, I guess that's 14 years ago, he somehow just published a terrific new article in the Times about a George Washington painting. Maybe he had it in the slush file for 14 years, I don't know. He can explain that as well. So I've known Ralph for decades. I dealt with him in my days as a public affairs official and his as a relentless reporter. We didn't always get along, but it's okay. He was tough. But it's great to see him. So panelists, let me ask you all to please take the stage. And as they do, audience, please turn off those cell phones. I've only heard 3 so far. So turn them off. Any devices that were not invented in the Roosevelt era should be off. The expert discussion, as they take their seats, I'll tell you the discussion will be followed by an audience Q&A, which Ralph will moderate. And then after we adjourn, you're invited upstairs, where our traditional wine and cheese reception will be augmented with some liquid refreshments more reminiscent of the speakeasy era. Just be sure, it snowed, so be very careful. Sip is fine, so you get the picture. We want you all to be safe. With that, it's a pleasure to reintroduce Bob Billingsley, Blanche Wiesen-Cook, and Dan Okrent, and to turn over the proceedings to Ralph Blumenthal. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. I'm glad we're on the same side for a change. And, talk about timing. 90 years ago, as Harold said, everyone was talking about the newly inaugurated president, and the first fireside chat a few days ago, and he was talking about the banking crisis. So hopefully the parallels will end there. But thanks to FDR's visionary FDIC and Social Security. So we're here to talk about another early landmark of the New Deal, the repeal of Prohibition. In December 1933, we're jumping the date a little bit to commemorate that. And we're much safer today. I'm sorry. Prohibition lasted from January 1920, 13 years, 10 months, and 19 days. Who's counting? But in that brief time, it really changed America. So I put together a couple of slides to highlight it. This is a bootlegging card from our collection at Baruch College, where I work in the library. Bootleggers were pretty brazen in those days. We have a collection of things like this from an advisor to FDR named Luther Halsey Gulick III, who was basically the Dean of Public Administration. And he advised Roosevelt as a governor and as president, a very influential guy. So we have his collection at Baruch. Now we have Dan's book, Last Call, which is a wonderful history of prohibition and repeal, featured in the Ken Burns documentary on PBS. This is the front page of the Herald Tribune, December 5th, 1933, repeal. And there it is. New Yorkers are getting their, I wouldn't say their first taste of liquor in 13 years, but their first legal taste. This is my book on the Store Club, which had a lot to do with Prohibition because it was founded during Prohibition, and it had various locations, the last one on 53rd Street off Fifth Avenue. It is Orson Welles, yeah. I guess so, yeah. This is the Cub Room, by the way, the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, very hard to get into. And Sherman would police the room very carefully. I mean, people like J. Edgar Hoover sat with Frank Costello. I mean, it was a very eclectic group. This is a book put together by Sherman's daughter, Charmaine, and Bob Billingsley's cousin. It's a book of recipes from the Store Club and drink recipes, and hopefully we'll get to sample some of them later. And finally, this is a book we have in the Baruch Library Collection. It's a Rockefeller study from 1936, and there's Luther Gulick, the public administration guru, who grappled with these very, very difficult issues. Once alcohol was legal, then what? So let me just lay out the terrain a little bit before we turn to the panel. You know, it was said that Prohibition was an absolutely perfect solution to the problem. The dries had their law, and the wets had their liquor. And Will Rogers said it best, of course. He said, "Prohibition is better than no liquor at all." The big puzzle was, and it remains a great puzzle for historians, and I hope we'll illuminate that a little bit today, how was it possible to pass an amendment outlawing such a basic staple of the American diet for hundreds of years? And then how was it possible to reverse that in less than 14 years? I mean, if Prohibition was unlikely to begin with, repeal seemed even more unlikely. And it was compared to, the prospects of repeal were compared to a hummingbird reaching Mars with the Washington Monument tied to its tail. So Prohibition was widely seen as a colossal failure, but Mabel Walker Willebrandt, one of the heroes, if you could say that, of the Prohibition era, Assistant Attorney General and one of the women who was really a leader of the country at that time, early feminist, said, "Prohibition has not failed. It has never been attempted." The US-Canadian border was so wet, it was amazing. It was said it didn't bleed off the map. Detroit was a city on a still. It's the second largest industry after automobiles was smuggling alcohol. And despite Prohibition, liquor was sold in saloons, nightclubs, dance halls, drugstores, cigar stores, paint stores, moving van offices, and everywhere else. The question was not where you could get a drink, but where couldn't you get a drink? And it was not true that during Prohibition you could walk into any speakeasy and be served instantly. You had to be introduced by a judge or a policeman. Mayor Jimmy Walker said, "Prohibition might be a good thing, but I don't know who's going to arrange it." Prohibition changed America, but it was not so much the cause of the change as an accelerant. Big things were already underway. Gender barriers were breaking. Tabloid coverage was coming to the fore, headlining gangsters and sex. Neighborhood gangs became criminal enterprises, syndicates, which would last a long time. Greenwich Village, which had been America's Bohemia, suddenly spawned Greenwich villages all over the country, thanks to Prohibition. But it's important to remember that while we consider Prohibition often as a joke, it really wasn't that funny. It caused tremendous pain and suffering, criminality, poisoning, death, official hypocrisy, entrenched corruption, and America would never be the same after it. better or worse. So since we're in the home of Eleanor and Franklin, I thought we'd begin with Eleanor's biographer, Blanche Wiesen Cook, and then we'll hear from Dan Okrent as a scholar of prohibition and repeal, followed by Bob Billingsley with his family story, and then I'm hoping we can sort of mix it up in the discussion so it won't be just one person speaking at a time, and I encourage everyone to chime in. So with that, Blanche.
Eleanor Roosevelt. Microphone. Sorry. Eleanor Roosevelt thought prohibition irrelevant and unimportant to all of the most urgent issues facing people. Cool. She was the daughter and relative of a family of alcoholics. People ask me, how did Eleanor Roosevelt become so compassionate? And I always said, because her heart was with people in want, in need, in trouble. People just like her own family. Her father, who she loved, died at the age of 34 of alcoholism. So pause. How much do you have to drink to die at 34? I mean, we're all still here. In addition, her aunts and uncles were all alcoholic and drug addicted. And that is the milieu in which she grew up and never judged harshly. One of the scenes of Eleanor Roosevelt in politics building bridges with Tammany, which FDR failed to build, but Eleanor was very good at. And so she would meet with the Tammany bosses, and they would be drinking and smoking, drinking rather a lot. And she would have sometimes champagne and sometimes sarsaparilla, but it was never a problem. And there are several wonderful scenes in my book where she is, she's building a movement. And folks want to bring prohibition into her activism, and she looks around at there's a group of women activists called the League to Enforce the Law, the Women's League to Enforce the Law. And she thinks this group, which is completely racist and Southern dominated and is allied with the Ku Klux Klan, is the enemy group. And so she says, well, if you want to support a constitutional amendment, support the 14th and 15th Amendment, or change your name to the supporters of the 18th Amendment. Anyway, that is consistently her policy and consistently her vision, and it never changes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you, Blanche. So, Dan, you'll maybe help enlighten us as to how this disastrous bill could have been passed in the first place and then repealed, amazingly. But
in other words, you want me to do 80 years of history in 5 minutes. Let's go for it. And
you were at the Times.
You took all of my laugh lines. I have none left.
Come on.
And I think you got them from my book.
I did.
Well, let me slide. Who's operating the slides? Or,
I can do it from here.
Please.
Wait a minute.
okay,
is this
so
the first?
this is sort of the beginning of the Prohibition movement. This is in 1873 in Hillsboro, Ohio, in southern Ohio, where these women were so put out as a gross understatement, of course. Their lives were so badly infected and affected by the drunkenness that prevailed, particularly in frontier towns, but also in the big cities, and how awful it was for family life when the father would go out to the tavern in the evening and would get smashed, and he would spend the rent money and might bring home venereal diseases because there were brothels attached to the saloons in those days. So it begins here and races across from Ohio to upstate New York and into a little bit of New England in just a few years. It's worth mentioning, I think, that there would have been no Prohibition Amendment without the efforts of the women who led it, to such a degree that Susan B. Anthony rose to speak before she was a suffragist. She was a temperance worker. She rose to speak at a New York State Convention of the Sons of Temperance, and she was told she could not speak. The sisters were here to listen, was the direct comment. And she realized at that point, she and her allies, that they would never be able to get rid of liquor until they took control of some governmental reins, i.e. get the vote. So the two movements, suffrage and prohibition, really coexist. They were coexisted and in fact entered the Constitution within, I think, 15 months of each other. Then along came this unprepossessing man, Wayne Wheeler, who was the one who figured out that the best way to bring about prohibition was to stick to one issue only. So he was the functioning head of an organizing campaign and of a lobbyist group called the Anti-Saloon League. Mostly, the board was entirely Methodist and Baptist preachers, largely from the Midwest. And he said, if we're going to get this done, we have to have one issue to stick to. So we will support in elections anyone who is on our side on this issue. He didn't care if that same person wanted to reinstate slavery or to slaughter every fourth child. It didn't make any difference. If you were with us, we will be the one who will get you elected. We can control 5 to 10% of the vote. That'll be enough. He coined the word pressure group, and he put together a coalition that stretched from the industrial workers of the world to the KKK, connected all on the prohibition issue, Socialist Party to a large degree as well. The thing that finally made it happen, two things. No, not yet. One was the 16th Amendment, which authorized the income tax, because until then, the federal government, largest source of domestic revenue was the liquor tax. And until there was something to replace that, there was no way that prohibition would pass. The other was World War I. All the brewers were German. They were using up the grain that was starving the starving Belgians. Lives were in peril. And this movement, patriotic movement, made it possible to get prohibition over the line. Okay, now we can go to the slides. Okay. However, there were exceptions, and this is the key thing to keep in mind about prohibition. The first exception was that liquor, this was in the Volstead Act, the enforcement mechanism, that liquor is something that could be used, that it was legal to preserve fruit that becomes alcohol. And this was done mostly for the farmers, who apple cider, hard apple cider, was everywhere in the western parts of the country. And in New York, it meant that huge railroad caravans would come from the Napa Valley and the Sonoma Valley to Patty's Market underneath the 9th Avenue L. And all of these guys are selling grapes to people who are preserving fruit at home by making their own wine. The next one was, here's the liquor price list for physicians and dentists from the august firm of S.S. Pierce, because it was important that you be able to use it for medicinal purposes. In 1917, the American Medical Association House of Delegates voted unanimously to say there was no reason to use alcohol in any therapeutic form at all, but then they saw an opportunity. And in 1922, they announced in their next convention that you could have, there were 27 diseases that could be cured, or at least helped with alcohol, ranging from cancer and diabetes to snakebite, and my favorite, old age. And they issued a statement that said that to not allow this was a serious interference with the practice of medicine. I'm using up my time. I'm going to go really fast from here. the routine was in New York, you could buy a prescription from a physician for $3. You would then take it to the drugstore, and you could get 1 pint every 10 days. And there was a list of what the disease was. And I have one at home from a Providence pharmacy. The diseases were debility, 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 debility. They were all fine after that. Next slide. Well, this also, sacramental purposes by the jug. This kind of came to an end in New York when there were two rabbis named Houlihan and McGuire who were arrested. True story. The Beaulieu vineyards in California became the leading vineyard because they had a lock on sacramental wine for the church in 11 different grape varietals, including port. Next. Well, this is how it was enforced in New York. This is not the Store Club, it's the 21 Club, where this went on constantly. Now, this is fairly late in Prohibition, it's 1929. There was no reason to worry about enforcement in New York. You had to give a $5 bill to the cop on the beat, and maybe a little bit more than that to the judge. But it was mostly ignored from 1924 forward. The idea of the peephole you look through, that's from the movies. That was about a year or two in New York and Chicago. And then it comes to an end. And this is the line of people on December 5th, 1933, outside the municipal building getting licenses to sell alcohol for the first time. So the city was ready for it. One last thing about how did it come to an end? Many factors, but the key factor was the Depression. Because after the market crash in 1929, federal revenue from the income tax plummeted by 35%. And there was no capital gains tax because nobody had capital gains. So what are we going to do? Bring back liquor. And so it happened.
Great segue to Bob Billingsley. Bob, your family got started in the drugstore business, as far as I can remember. And that was their, at least that was Sherman's segue into bootlegging. But tell us a little bit about your father and how they got into the business.
Sure. I thought I would talk about, this is my first time here. That's the reason why I typed this out and was going to read it. And how am I going to multitask with a phone and all the rest? So what I'm going to give you a little bit of this unplugged. But anyway, so Ralph gives me a call and says, going to be on a panel, and this is my first time here. So Ralph, in 1996, wrote a book that said my father was a crook, okay? And then Dan wrote a book in 2011 calling my dad a criminal operative. So I was worried about Blanche. This is going to be really a voyage of discovery. And then I thought, Roosevelt House, thank you for having me here. Is this a pattern that you have people come and speak at your panels and two other people have said your dad's a crook? But anyway, I find it very novel. And I found out my buddy here grew up in the Bronx. We have any other people here from the Bronx? Come on, proudly, right? Okay, because the Bronx is a big part of this. So in doing research for this, I found a letter, in 1928 from FDR to my father, and the address, he says, is 49 East 65th Street, and I'm still trying to find that, but that's where FDR says to write him. And he's soliciting my dad for his support of Al Smith in the upcoming election. This is September, so this is before, FDR gets the nomination. And what I'd like to ask you all is, after you hear my story, if you think, FDR might have wanted to retract the letter. So, because 10 years before this letter was sent, purportedly, and I've read it, that my father and his three brothers were the most successful bootleggers in the United States, which I found out when I was 50. And I've gotten one speeding ticket in my life. I am a goody two-shoes that went through, I'm a Catholic, the folks that gave you original sin, and this is who I am, okay? And so, and I have a navy blue heart, so when I found this out, and it was from him, okay, I was totally shocked. But so what they did was from 1907 to 1920, when they came to New York, they would go to states, flipping from wet to dry, okay, and they would bootleg there. And why don't you put up the first slide here? And this is, you know, talk about having your father looking over your shoulder, right? But anyway, on the left is my Uncle Fred, who was the gang enforcer, who slept with 2 pistols under his pillow. Next to him is the bootlegging prodigy, my Uncle Sherman, the youngest, the best driver of the gang. And next to him is my Uncle Ora, who I knew quite well. Ora was the bookkeeper, okay? And Ora was also the peacemaker, because these guys were always feuding. And last but not least is my father, Logan Billingsley, who was then 34, the leader of the gang and the brains of the outfit, who, when I found out what was going on 50 years ago, I read a newspaper article in the Seattle Times that referred to my father as, quote, the underworld boss of the Pacific Northwest. Right. 50 years of therapy. But anyway, so anyhow, they started off, as you can see, they're classically good-looking guys. They're also clean-cut, and they're very soft-spoken. They got this Matthew McConaughey thing going, and they disarm people where they go, these Oklahoma types, but they're ferocious. I mean, they all are carrying, and so anyway, let me flip this slide, and now I'm not this. They're kind of like the Marco Polos of bootlegging, and I'll just deal how they start off. How did your dad get into the business? Well, he got into the business, and he was the first one, because in Anadarko, Oklahoma, in 1904, he had to pay legal fees because he shot and killed a man. So that was the necessity where they needed money. Oklahoma goes dry in 1907, and Logan goes out drinking with his buddies, and he can't finish what's in his flask, and they say, I'll buy it from you. Interesting, my dad didn't drink much. Sherman didn't drink much, and because it was business to them. So that's how they got in the business. And what I call your attention to is look at the dates, when these states go dry, okay? And look at when my relatives show up. I mean, that's the correlation. That's the correlation here. What else do I want to say about this? So they wind up in New York in 1920, and of course, New York's gone dry by then. The 18th Amendment in 1919. What I'd like to do too, I thought it might be interesting. What do you do when you set up a bootlegging operation? How do you do it? And what these guys did, in business school parlance, they call it first mover. That's when you get there before everybody else and you set up brand loyalty. And they would get there, for instance, in Seattle, which I'll deal with. Why don't we go to this is what happened ultimately. At the end of the road, my dad had 5 prison escapes. And this is one of them. He sawed his way out of prison, and his mistress supplied the hacksaw. She smuggled it in. But in Seattle, what Logan does is the state's going dry January 1, of 1916, okay? Logan gets there in November. And what he does is the first thing he does is he buys a cash register repair firm, because that's how he networks with the local business people, and you want to sort of do it quietly. Then he buys blocks in a bank to his money, launder his money, as my mentor knows. Then he buys a warehouse, in Seattle, and then he buys a drugstore. So come January 1st, 1916, when the state goes dry, they're ready to go. So how much money do they make? They make a lot of money. For instance, in my researching this and getting to know my father, I found a bill from 1916 from their supplier in San Francisco. And the supplier, this is billed for a very small amount. It's only $4,600. But I know that they sold it for 10 times that much, even after bribes. Well, part of the reason is that they're watering it down before they sell it, you know. So that's like early in 1916. By the end of 1916, they got 5 drugstores, you know, and they're getting deliveries at their warehouse of like several tons a month. And I know this because they're in the court so much, there's all these deposition, and I look at, you know, one of the bills of lading, and I see, God, this stuff that's coming in. So anyway, after Seattle, the last stop, my father's stop before coming to New York, is that they're in Michigan, okay, his hometown. And they get there in December of 1917, the 4 of them, okay? And the state's going dry in April. And Detroit is 1 million people. It's the 4th largest city in America. So they get there, and somehow they create a virtual monopoly of running booze in from wet Toledo, Ohio, to wet Detroit, okay? And then, turn the slide. They get caught, okay? So they get caught in September, and these are their cars, okay? These are cars, and it's Sherman and Ora doing it, okay? And this is their contraband up front, okay? But they have very good lawyers, and they get sentenced to Leavenworth, but they have very good lawyers, so they postpone it until 1921. So, you know, next week they're selling in drugstores, groceries, which Sherman owns in Seattle. But my dad, the most interesting to me, the interesting scam before he comes to New York, and I'll get him there in a second, is in 1919, my dad was in partnership, and I didn't know this. I knew he was in partnership with the mob, but last week I found out it's the real mob. I mean, it's the Sicilian mob. It's the guys, you know, Game of Thrones, chop off both your arms, throw you into it. And that's my dad, dealing with people like that. So what they're doing is they're buying this stuff in Canada, and they're shipping it in by rail car, okay? And it's like 500 to 1,000 cases in these rail cars, and they're doing it from July to December. And I also too. Let me go to. Okay, this is an actual bill, and these are rare because criminals, you know, don't have paperwork. But I got all this stuff from my family. My family album is not pictures; it's indictments and liquor bills. But so on the right of this is the actual guys, and Ralph told me that my father's paying off. So if you're related to W.R. Barger in Detroit, you know, your relative was a crook because my old man was paying him off to unload these cars. So Logan comes up with the idea, you know, in fall. And these are marked, by the way, to Havana. So that's the bill. It says Detroit to Havana, you know. So what happens is when they get to Detroit, they offload this stuff, okay? So then Logan says, I'm not making enough money. So in December, he starts working it with the railroad so that the liquor is not going to stop in Detroit, you know? And he skips out on the Sicilian mob. My father, who used to read to me, skips out on the Sicilian mob. And he goes to Havana, and he sells his stuff. You know, six months worth of doing this for $300,000 in 1990. You know, multiply that times 23 or 20 or whatever. And he takes that money, and he comes to New York, okay? And that's his seed money for, he thinks, a liquor operation. But it's not. It's not. He comes to New York, and he changes his mind, and he goes into real estate, which I'm in, and he becomes this, he builds later on, why don't you put that next slide up there? He builds this. If you know the Bronx, and my friend here does, Blanche is from the Bronx, this was called the Theodore Roosevelt Apartments, which purportedly was the largest apartment building in the world in 1923. My dad builds that. He becomes a pillar of the community. He's president of the Bronx Chamber of Commerce. He follows, if you know your highways, Major Deegan, okay? And the Bronx at this time is the fastest growing borough in New York. Ed Flynn, big Roosevelt guy, is there. And Dad is really legit, okay? And then Roosevelt writes him this letter in 1928, you know? And I like to think all of my father's past came out in 1930, and I guess maybe FDR wanted to withdraw the letter, but I think it's a great story of New York roots and where a lot of us came from. So that's sort of my family story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. It's a classic case of money of laundering and how money can go through this process and come out completely clean. So Blanche, you wrote that prohibition, along with religious bigotry, ripped the Democratic Party apart, and some of the Democratic women were opposed to Al Smith, who was a notable wet. I mean, what did Eleanor think of Al Smith? Did they get along?
Yes. Eleanor really supported Al Smith, and she really despised the attacks on him by the most bigoted. She actually says that the attacks on Al Smith taught her what prejudice was and how horrible prejudice is, and it really changed her.
But Al didn't return the love. I mean, he turned his back
Well-
on FDR, didn't he, and
Well,
became a right-winger?
He and Eleanor Roosevelt really remained silent when FDR started to viciously fight. And Al Smith attacked FDR. But, I mean, you said that Al Smith moved to the right. What he did was he was just so bitter that after years, decade of a kind of political partnership in which FDR won everything and Al Smith lost everything, FDR never appointed him to anything, and he was sidetracked and bitter and angry and hurt. And so then he started to attack FDR.
Right, even though
And
upstairs, there's a picture of the two of them sitting together in the same room we were sitting in
Right.
upstairs.
Well, that was before the president. That was before the presidency. But it's a very sad story, and Eleanor Roosevelt remains quiet during their inimical years, which is sort of interesting.
But Dan,
But the attacks on Al Smith and on Roman Catholics was just appalling. And so he's called all kinds of names, and, the Romanesque drip, alcoholic, fiend, and so on.
wasn't there a cartoon in your book of what the cabinet meeting would look like if Al Smith were elected? The Pope would be sitting at the head.
The anti-Catholicism. That's what beat Al Smith. That and economic conditions were pretty good. But the Dries interpreted the 1928 election as an endorsement of prohibition because Al Smith was a wet. Therefore, beginning the Congress that convenes in 1929 passes laws, punishment laws, far, far more severe than had been in place before, which creates an enormous reaction. There was a woman in Lansing, Michigan. Michigan had 3 strikes and you're outlawed. She was a mother of 5, and her 3rd strike was a pint of whiskey, and she was sentenced to 10 years. And that sort of stuff made the newspapers regularly. And in fact, I think one can say that Smith was sort of like the sacrificial lamb who made repeal possible.
But I mean, there was another element. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that Eleanor Roosevelt said she supported Al Smith because he was a man with a heart, and he had vision and concern for all people. And that was the kind of progressive politician we needed. And in the 20s, that was true.
So did she and Franklin argue over Al Smith? I mean, did they have completely different views of him?
Well, in the beginning, FDR just ran against him
Right.
and kept beating him. He didn't hate him in the beginning, but the hatred and the enmity began because he didn't give him any job. He didn't recognize him. He isolated him.
Interesting. So there's a situation going on during Prohibition that is akin to today when the state legislatures were gerrymandered, or the whole configuration of the country gave tremendous power to rural America, right?
This is an important thing to remember. Prohibition never had majority support in this country. Obviously, there was no exact polling, but there's no evidence that it did. In New York State, a state Senate district in Brooklyn had 7 times as many people as the typical upstate district. So that before Baker v. Carr and other big Supreme Court cases, the power of the rural areas was overwhelming. They also wanted to keep the immigrant population subdued, so it was a double whammy for them.
So there's a lot of bigotry involved too, right? I mean, it was anti-Jewish, the Jews were
think who was running the big city political machines in the late 19th and early 20th century? Irish, Italian, Jewish, overwhelmingly. And there was no question that bigotry was a driver there. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the KKK was a dry supporting organization, and at the same time supported women's suffrage.
Huh, that's interesting. Strange bedfellows indeed. And it was also anti-black, I'm right? They blamed liquor for increasing criminality among...
Well, yes, but the KKK, you have to remember, blacks didn't have any rights in this country in the 20s. They thought that blacks were in their place. They were much more in the 20s. That version of the KKK was an anti-Catholic, primarily, and anti-Jewish organization.
Interesting. Obviously, the crash and the Depression were big factors in this epic reversal from Prohibition, which seemed unstoppable when it was passed, right? Nobody could ever imagine that it would be reversed.
The idea of repeal, no amendment had ever been repealed. That wasn't even something that was under discussion as a possibility. And it's one of the reasons why Wheeler and company pushed for a constitutional amendment. They knew that an act of Congress signed by a dry president could be overturned by an act of Congress and then signed by a wet president. So they put it in the Constitution, and it's there forever, was their thinking. The repeal movement started late and it was like a waterfall, particularly after the 1930 election, when the Republicans were voted out of Congress and a Democratic, mostly wet Congress took over.
Right. And a lot of the plutocrats thought that if we repeal the Prohibition, then the money coming in from the liquor tax will replace the income tax, so we'll get away paying income tax.
The DuPont family financed the repeal movement, and one of the DuPont brothers said, for each nickel can of beer, if there's a half a cent goes to the government, then they don't need our income tax any longer.
And then DuPont became a real right-winger, right? I mean, didn't he was a Liberty League? And
He always was. The DuPonts were right-wingers, but they were wet right-wingers. And if you're going to have a right-winger, you might as well have a wet one.
Right, and the Rockefellers, who started off as dries.
Very, very dry. And when John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was totally dry, because of that report that was shown before reflects it, when he came out after the study that he commissioned and said, this isn't working, let's give up on it, that was another major, major step that gave air cover to a lot of people to make repeal possible. He never had a drink. Among his sons, Nelson, we all know Nelson. Nelson, he actually had a cocktail he liked, orange juice and sherry.
Very effete.
Yeah, well.
Bob, whenever I drive on the Major Deegan and just by Yankee Stadium, you go up that hill, I think that was the location of one of Sherman's first drugstores. When you talked about Logan and his brothers, this all preceded national prohibition, right?
Well, it did, but it did, but recently I found a grand jury indictment that Logan actually was brought up on the National Prohibition Act after the amendment was passed, but before the Volstead Act, okay? And actually, it's from our friend Judge Tuttle, who you write about in Last Call a lot. So they were, but actually, when Logan goes to New York, he goes legitimate, I think, and Sherman, he lends Sherman the money to buy we have Bronx people here, the Morris Heights Pharmacy. And then Sherman, who is a bootlegging genius, he starts opening up drugstores all over the place. And he names them after the women, that he's carrying on with. He loves showgirls. He names one the Helen Morgan. He names another Ann Pennington. He names another one after Hazel Donnelly, who he marries. And Logan then buys a silent interest in a pharmacy on Fulton Street in Brooklyn. And then what happens with Sherman is he gets kidnapped, too many times, and he's had enough of this. I mean, the Billingsley boys, they're from the Wild West. You shoot someone, one bullet, they're dead. In New York, it's, carnage. And he gets kidnapped, and he goes into real estate with Dad, and they build something. I don't know if you're familiar with Billingsley Terrace, and Morris Heights, and a lot of stuff on Fordham Road. And then Sherman actually gets involved in the Store Club through a real estate deal, because two guys come from Oklahoma, okay, and they want a speakeasy, and Sherman's a broker. So he finds a deal for them at 132 West 58th Street, which you can all go see. It's a pretty good Greek restaurant now.
Yeah, it's a Greek restaurant.
Yeah, it's a good Greek restaurant. And you could go see it. And then what happens is his partners say, I don't want to be in this, okay? And buy me out. He says, forget about that. They sell out to a guy named Healy, who is a front, And then Oni Madden, Big Bill Dwyer, who you write about, and Demange throw up. They do that too, but they're really big-time criminals. Oni Madden, Oni the Killer Madden, in the Cotton Club. So they say to Sherman, we don't own the Store Club. We own part of you. And his skills are so good that they bring him in on all of their nightclubs. He's got a managerial skill because he's a genius. Sherman puts, for instance, if you go to one of his places, the Speakeasy, he puts matches in your pocket from the Store Club so that you do it. So anyway, he gets into bootlegging through there, and then, Prohibition comes.
Well, he said when he found out he had mob partners, he was shocked.
Yeah.
Shocked.
Yes.
Anyway,
Anyway.
time has come for some questions. So what we'll do... Thank you. We have some mics going around. If you raise your hand, I'll recognize you. You'll get a mic. Please keep the question short. Yes. Mic's coming.
Thank you.
Should be on.
When you wanted to go out for a drink during Prohibition, did the locale into which you went determine the quality of the liquor you got? Could you always be sure if you were in the 21 Club, you'd have good Canadian stuff, or if you were at the corner, you'd have Rotgut?
There was a huge business in label counterfeiting. There was a huge business, industrial alcohol, which you need to make photographic film, pencil lead, so on and so forth, would be turned into alcohol with food coloring added to it, and then a label put on the bottle. And the high-class places like the 21 Club, they said it was all the real thing, but I don't think you could ever be safe and sure that it was the real thing.
And people did die.
Yeah, they did. To me, it's interesting dealing with my family. The first thing they sell in 1907, I see a headline in the Anadarko paper, my father is selling something called mistletoe, which I think is the kryptonite of its time in making this. And then in Seattle, something called, it's a whiskey, but he's watering it down, something called Pink's. Then, of course, with Hiram Walker, it's the drink of Don Draper, Canadian Club, which I guess was like #1 or something at the time. And also they have price points. I mean, there's stuff that you can buy, which is jet fuel, or I should say airplane fuel at that time, and then it's better brand. But you can never be sure of this stuff that you're getting.
The Scottish Liquor Trust, the distillers company, which controlled all the big brands of Scotch, invented a brand. Cutty Sark was done specifically for the American market. So for a while, people believed Cutty Sark that's the stuff because it's coming from Scotland. They got a lot of publicity for it. But then the Cutty Sark label counterfeiters kind of destroyed their business.
So we can be thankful today, at least, for the authenticity of our brands. In the back there.
You mentioned this woman who, a mom, got 10 years. Presumably she was still in prison when repeal happened. Were the persons imprisoned for alcohol crimes let go after repeal?
It was state by state. The harshest enforcement was at the state level, and Michigan had this particular law. That was a Michigan state crime. I don't know about her specifically, but most people were out of prison who had been put in prison in Michigan within a year or a year and a half, mostly.
Yes, over here.
Are there lessons being learned?
Because this is going out on Zoom, so.
Are there lessons being learned through studying prohibition and its repeal related to the marijuana and decriminalization and legalization? And are they being applied or are they not being applied well enough?
I think that I'm going to let Blanche have the line that she's said before, that Eleanor said. But what we learned is you can't legislate against human desires. That's why there's prostitution everywhere, even though it's always been seen as a bad thing, going back to ancient times. And Eleanor thought,
Eleanor said you cannot legislate about what people want, because if they want it, they will go and get it. And she was very clear about that. I just wanted to add one thing, because she had, being surrounded by a family of alcoholics, she really had a divided sense about prohibition. And there's one time when she gets a communication from her Uncle Valley's mistress. Can you do something about your uncle? He's drinking nonstop, and he's been drunk for a whole month. And this is 1927, and Eleanor Roosevelt writes to Eleanor Morgenthau, I'm wondering how I can get the place raided. It's not only Valley, but some young boys on the farm under 20 whom he influenced are drunk constantly, and the mother is dying of tuberculosis and is at her wit's end. Isn't it too annoying? Tonight I want the Volstead law enforced, and I want to get rid of all the state police who connive with the bootleggers.
Wow.
So
I nominate Blanche as the #1 channeler of Eleanor. Other questions? You know, I want to say that after repeal, which is the book I showed you on the screen, the Rockefeller study, grappled with horrendous problems. First of all, 7 states continued with prohibition. 5 left out beer as non-intoxicating. So 7 continued prohibition. 12 approved liquor, but only at home. In other words, only package sales. And 29 in Washington, D.C. allowed sale by the glass as well. So that was only one of the key issues. Then, you know, what kind of alcohol would be permitted? Wine, beer, spirits, under what conditions, what hours? Should the liquor laws be enforced on a statewide level? Should they be enforced locally? Should they be liquor boards? Who would appoint the boards? Should they be elected? I mean, on and on. Luther Gulick, who was the fellow I mentioned, whose collection we have at Baruch, who studied government administration, said alcohol provided the perfect case study for a study of how government works or should work.
Right.
I just, if I could.
Yeah.
And then I'll ask a question.
My
after you
last
go.
sentence, I promise, I got to work out the clauses so it stays one sentence. It became much harder to get a glass of liquor after repeal than it was before, because, there was a comma there, because there were no rules in the time of, you know, if you wanted to have a bar across the street from a school next door to a church and keep it open 24 hours a day and give a drink to an 8-year-old, you could. But once you had state liquor enforcement laws in place and a licensing system, no longer. Harold Holzer.
So here's I want to ask a question because we discussed this a bit in the green room. This is the $64,000 question because Bob has a letter from, I hope it's 47-49, not just 49, because 49 is Mom's house. I don't think he would write from Mom's side of our house,
I
but
don't know, have you been getting bills to the wrong people?
we send back even the 47. It's okay.
That's-
So here's my question. What was the liquor consumption or delivery to this house during Prohibition?
Well, we know that because, and I think I know it from Dan's book, 4 cases came in before.
4 cases on January 19th of 1920, right? Because it was legal to drink whatever you had in your house when the law went into effect.
So if you were rich, you could stockpile it, and if you were poor, you couldn't.
And then there's Campobello. Then there's Campobello, which is
Canada.
absolutely the place to go for as much as you want. And Eleanor Roosevelt does all of her international entertaining up there. One day she has to break the glass locked liquor cabinet because she's lost her key, and there are diplomats visiting, and of course they want to have some alcohol. And Eleanor Roosevelt never hesitates to give people what they want to drink, both here and there. But the liquor is up there, and they bring it back and forth.
When Churchill visited, I mean, that was after Prohibition, so luckily for him. He
Churchill wrote in the guest book at Beaulieu Vineyards that these people do not recognize the entire history of civilization.
Didn't he get hit by a cab on Park Avenue, Churchill, and he was in the hospital?
So anyway, please join me in thanking this amazing panel.